Hello, everybody. Welcome. Um, we're gonna get started right at noon, so we're just giving it a second for people to pop in, and then it turns noon every time. All right. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our Leading the Conversation webinar, hosted by NAMI Northern Illinois. My name is Danielle Angelari, and I apologize for the state of my voice. I'm starting to get sick. But I'm the executive director of NAMI Northern Illinois, which is an affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, created to build better lives for individuals and families touched by mental illness. As we wrap up 2024, just wanted to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for your participation and support throughout the year. Your commitment to these important conversations have tremendous impact, and we're grateful for you as a part of our community. And with the holiday season upon us, we also want to wish you a restful holiday season and a happy new year ahead. Now to kick off today's session, we're honored to welcome Cody Berillo. I'm saying that correctly, right?
You are.
Okay, awesome. Who is leading our conversation on grief. Grief is a deeply personal experience that touches us all in unique ways, and Cody's insights and compassionate approach will provide you perspective on how you can better understand and navigate this complex experience. Since 2018, Cody has been providing grief support services to the community of Rockford. She has worked with different organizations throughout the community to provide advocacy, crisis intervention, and grief support services to local families in various settings. Cody offers grief counseling, support, and companionship to the bereaved. She recently received her certificate in death and grief studies through the Center for Loss and Life Transition in Fort Collins, Colorado. Cody believes companioning bereaved individuals involves reflecting on the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual parts while following a holistic model. She has experience working with children, adolescents, and adults in the areas of death and grief, anticipatory grief and terminal illness, extended grief, and caregiver support. Just a few housekeeping notes. We will facilitate questions at the end, but if you would like to add them as we go, there's the Q&A feature or the chat, and I will be looking for those to help facilitate. But please join me in welcoming Cody to discuss grief and how we can support ourselves and others through it. Thanks, Cody.
Thank you. She gave you my bio. I'm a private practice therapist over at Four Corners. I've been here since we opened here in May. And Danielle, I cannot see my PowerPoint. I just don't know if you know, but I also work for the Haven Network, which is a perinatal hospice and bereavement center. I am the vice president on the board of directors there. I do some volunteer work as therapist, as well as family service volunteer as well. So I'm going to get started. Today is going to be about understanding grief in that process and hopefully unlearning some of the things that we might know or perceive as grief and relearning the things that are more true to what might be considered grief and mourning. Okay, Danielle, next slide. So I'm not sure, I can't see everybody, so bear with me here, but typically I would ask everybody if they've heard of the 5 stages of grief, and if you're here, I imagine you probably have. The 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, and they were written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969 in her book on death and dying. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, Danielle, I'll kind of explain this. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote this actually for the terminally ill. So it would make sense with the denial, the bargaining, the anger. And because we're a very anti-death, anti-emotion culture, we as a Western culture decided to adopt that idea to give us a reason as to why, we might be feeling certain emotions. But the truth really is grief isn't orderly. It's actually quite messy. And if anybody has a significant loss of their own, they're going to understand that on a deep personal level. But people often experience more than one feeling at a time, and they do return later on as well. You don't just feel one emotion and move on to that next step or stage, just as it was misconstrued in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And obviously, if you've ever experienced a significant loss, you know that there's certainly more than 5 emotions in grief. And a lot of the times you can feel them like we said, all at one time. You might not even be able to explain what you're feeling because you're experiencing what we call a paradox of emotions. So those conflicting emotions. So for instance, if you're moving through your grief process and you're starting to be able to feel some happiness, you might then feel some guilt for feeling happy. I'm sure some of you can relate to that in a multitude of ways, but maybe even specifically with the holidays coming up. I know people have a hard time enjoying holidays, and when they do, they feel like they should feel debilitated and sad, but it's miserable feeling debilitating and sad. So there's those paradox of emotions, those conflicting feelings. Okay, go ahead. So I'm here to teach you about the basics of grief as well. Grief and mourning, as we know as a culture, has been interchangeably used. People often think it means the same thing, and in reality, it does not. So if you go to a grief-informed therapist, they will tell you the difference of grief and mourning within the first few sessions, hopefully. But I'm here to tell you today the difference of grief and mourning. So go ahead. So grief is anything that you feel on the inside. So anybody who's experienced a loss, and it doesn't necessarily always need to be a death. It could be a job loss, a house loss, a move, anything like that, a divorce. So what you do is you feel that on the inside, no matter what, right? It's how you express it, and we'll get to that in a second. But any thoughts or emotional, physical symptoms, even unexpected behaviors are all part of the grief process. And then we'll talk about mourning. Mourning is everything that you express on the outside. So also known as grief gone public. So mourning is anything external. So grief is inside, mourning is outside. So if you're talking about the person, if you're crying, if you're writing or journaling or putting together a photo display, there's so many things that you can do to express the mourning process. I could have probably done a whole seminar on things to do in order to mourn. But even surrounding the holidays, if you set out a plate, right, you're showing that outward mourning, that what we call movement in the process or perturbation within the process of grief and mourning. So the goal here when you are going through a grief process is moving that grief from which, inside to outside. So moving from grief into that mourning, or also known as clinicians from head to heart. Next slide. Okay, so a typical question I get asked is, can you have grief without mourning? And that's 100% a yes. So again, anytime you experience a loss, not necessarily physical, but you often, or you will always naturally grieve. But it's only if you express it is how you get to that healing process. So some people might be stuck because they've never actually mourned the loss. They've only grieved it inside. And so then it comes out in a lot of different symptoms, and we can talk a little bit about those here in a little bit. But it is essential that we do go through that mourning process to get to that healing at the end of it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is as a clinician, I don't think I mentioned to you guys, I do work in private practice. I mentioned that, but I only do grief work. So when I became a specialist of grief, I started focusing only on that. So any of my new clients that do come in are only grief related. I don't deal with anything else. So with that said, I have a lot of experience with that. So this is 100% the number one question I get asked is, how long does grief really last? The question I love to combat that with is, how high is up, right? We don't know. Grief never goes away. It's something that sticks with you your entire life. You don't just have somebody in your life and lose that part of your life and forget, right? We don't just move. I don't love the term move on. So we move forward with life, right? So there's a quote that I love when we talk about healing from the grief process, that there is no old you to get back to. There's only a new you to create and nurture. So with that said, I think it's really important to remember that this grief journey doesn't end, and it is something that, how high is up? Nobody actually knows. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Hi, Danielle. So I mentioned before, I studied under a doctor named Dr. Alan Wolfelt. He's very primarily known for doing his grief work. He's been in the field since the 1980s. Um, and he opened a grief center in Colorado in the 80s, when grief wasn't really talked about or on the map, or and now that things are a little bit more open, he created these 6 central needs of mourning, which are so important to anybody who is grieving a loss. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be that physical loss. It could be that job loss, that house loss, the divorce, right? So number one is always acknowledging the reality of a loss. So either if you're working with somebody or you yourself are grieving, acknowledging that reality of the loss is our first symptom that we need to express, right? To have the 6 central needs of mourning. The second one is embracing the pain of the loss. So first, that acknowledgement, second, embracing it. The third is remembering the person who died. That's so essential, just so we can do that mourning process. And then number 4 is developing that new self-identity. And again, that's where that quote comes in about there's no old you to go back to. A lot of traditional medical model of treatment says we have to get back to how we were. We have to get back to how we were. Unfortunately, that old part of ourself is kind of frozen in that time. I often explain it. There's a Japanese art called kintsugi. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Where they take a ceramic dish and they smash it on the ground, and they pick up all those pieces. So that smashing on the ground is that grief, right? That we've experienced a significant loss. We're shattered, we're on the floor, but how that, new identity, developing that new identity, they pick up the pieces and they actually put them together and they seal them with gold. So there's that new self-identity. I like to kind of refer to it as that. Number 5 is search for meaning. And that looks different for absolutely everybody. Meaning in a loss, there's no predicting what it's going to be. I've had people come in who do an entire career change. I've had people come in who, their meaning is just putting out a plate for Christmas, and that's okay. And I don't want to misconstrue meaning as in relief, because a lot of people think that that end goal of a grief process should be, oh, okay, we're okay with this, we've accepted the loss. There's really no acceptance. You might not ever accept a loss, but if you can search for meaning in that loss. I can give you my own personal example. I lost my first daughter in 2014 and I lost another daughter in 2017. And I worked in the financial field at the time. I was pretty much lost in life on what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until I sought grief therapy that I was like, this is actually pretty good. And I think more people could use this support and this knowledge, because again, we're such an emotion phobic anti-death culture. It goes back to even at home, where what I call the goldfish phenomenon, when you have a fish for a child, right, and it dies, our culture says, oh no, the parents need to go to the store really quick and they need to replace it. Well, that's not true, right? It starts at home, and it starts with that educating kids that grief is a part of life, and it is something they are gonna experience. And so if we can prepare that from an early age, we can hopefully experience that a little bit more gracefully and less avoidant. So that search for meaning again. So like I said, with my experiences, I went and became a grief therapist. That's not everybody's role. That's not everybody's end goal. Sometimes people find it difficult to work close to grief in any way. Whether it's you've had somebody who passed in hospice and you would love to volunteer for hospice, you just have to make sure that you have your own stuff set into place. Is it my volume potentially? Okay. I just turned my volume up. I hope it's my volume. And then the last step is letting others help now and always. I think that now and always is so important because again, being that anti-death emotion phobic culture, somebody passes away, we have a service. Usually that support goes away within a month or two. So allowing people to help from now and always. Go ahead, Dana, next. Oh, so these are some common symptoms of grief. This is not the limit of what a symptom of grief can be, because it goes into things such as complex grief and compound loss, things like that, that are a little bit more complex than what we're going to deal with today. But these are the typical common symptoms of grief. And if anybody has more to add to this, please add them in the chat and I can, shout them out and let everybody know. But the first one is that anhedonia. So an inability to feel joy or feeling numb, having those depressive symptoms. I have a lot of people feel this in early grief. So they don't necessarily want to get out of bed. They're just feeling that depression and they're like, well, I've never been depressed before, so I don't know why I'm feeling depressed now. It's that anhedonia. It's not necessarily depression. And that hopefully will soften over time once we process some of that loss. The second one would be lethargy of grief. So we get a lot of people who just feel very lethargic a lot of the times, especially if it's a significant loss, such as a spouse, a child, anybody within the home, or somebody that's just very important to that person. We do see a lot of that lethargy of grief. I know it's concerning to a lot of support family and friends when they see that lethargy of grief, but it is common to have. Short-term memory loss is a pretty big one as well. I get a lot of people in here who are like, I can't remember anything. I don't know why. I used to be really good at my job and now I'm forgetting these little details. Or, I used to be able to go to a grocery store and not need a list. And now I need a list and I'm reliant upon that. And again, that will soften with time. Polyphasic behaviors is really common as well. And the best example I have that people can relate to this is cleaning. So if anybody likes to clean, that's wonderful. But even if you don't, we all do have to clean at some point, right? But say you had a typical routine for cleaning, and you've now experienced a loss. So that typical routine might have looked like you go from the laundry room, and then you go to the kitchen, and then you go to the living room, and then you go to your bedroom and the bathroom, and you have this really routine kind of way to clean. It doesn't have to be that routine, but you have a typical kind of way that you clean. The polyphasic behaviors after a loss is, say you are going to start in the laundry room. So you try starting in the laundry room and you realize, oh, there's shoes that need to be put away. So you take those shoes, you walk to the bedroom, you put those shoes in the bedroom where they belong, and you see, oh, I forgot, I have to put this away, or I need to start a load of laundry. So you go back to the laundry room, you start that load of laundry, you see something else that needs to be put away. So then you walk to the kitchen and you realize, oh, that dish needs to be washed. So I'm going to wash that dish, right? So it's kind of that erratic behavior of trying to figure things out and it's not in a pattern. So it can be seen, and like I said, the easiest example for me to explain is cleaning, but it can be seen as scheduling, can be seen in work, production. It can be seen in a lot of different ways. The sleep, the appetite, and the mood disturbances are really common. You get people who either are oversleeping, right, which is that anhedonia. You get them that are experiencing insomnia. You have people who have an increase in an appetite or a decrease in an appetite. And these all do depend on prior grief experiences, how those actually were dealt with in the past, and then those mood disturbances as well. Transient thoughts of resisting forward is really common. So someone might come to a clinician and say, I wouldn't really mind it if I didn't wake up tomorrow, right? And as a clinician, instead of jumping down that, oh, do you have a plans, means, intent, it's learning more about what they mean about wanting to not wake up that following day. It's not necessarily a suicidal ideation. Now, as if you're a clinician in this, listening to me here, don't disregard that. Obviously, you still have to ask those questions, but making sure that you're not jumping into that right away and getting to learn, oh, okay, so what I'm understanding is you don't want to wake up tomorrow. Is that because of XYZ? Are you sad? Are you overwhelmed? Are you missing that person, right? A lot of people, especially people of faith who believe, in an afterlife, they just want to go see that person. It doesn't necessarily mean they want to end their life. Now, again, there are cases that do, so please be mindful of that. But also, you know, the idea, I don't know if I have any people who've lost spouses in here, but I had a widow at one point who refused to go into the new year. Even though it was January, she still said it was the year that her husband died, because she was refusing to go forward into that new year. She was not going to be experiencing a new year without him. So unfortunately, up until the day that she passed away, she said that it was that year that he died. People experience grief bursts as well. This is really common early on and very distantly as well. So a grief burst is just exactly what it sounds like. It's a burst of grief out of nowhere. If anybody's ever experienced a significant loss, we know that, you know, it can come from left field. We have no idea what caused it sometimes we do. Sometimes it can be 10 years down the road and you hear a song of somebody and all of a sudden that reminds you of that person. And all of a sudden you catch yourself crying and you're like, I haven't cried about that person in, you know, 5 years. This has been 10 years since they've been gone. I don't know what's going on. Well, that's just a grief burst. The way that I explain grief to people that I talk to is that you're on a boat in the ocean, like a little canoe, and you've lost your oars. So you are at the mercy of the sea. And if anybody knows the ocean, which I'm sure we all do, you know, sometimes it's smooth sailing and it's beautiful out. You get a nice sunrise or sunset. Sometimes it's a little bit choppier. We're experiencing a little bit more emotion. Then other times it's just capsizing waves where we're just like, I don't know how we're going to survive this storm. So knowing that sometimes those grief bursts do happen in all of that, make the waters a little choppier. But we do experience them for the rest of our natural lives, so they don't go away. And then most people want to be by or carry what we call linking objects. And linking objects are objects that either remind us of the person or were the person's. So if you have, say, like a necklace full of ashes, and you're like, I'm never taking this off because I'm always going to wear this because this is literally my person, that is perfectly fine. We typically want to be by those linking objects that remind us of those people that we've lost. And those should lessen with time. If we're talking about somebody who you're very close with, you might rent a storage locker and put all their things in there, and it might sit, you know, for years, right? You're not ready to, you know, downsize your linking objects, but essentially, if you're having a healthy grief process, what should happen is we should be experiencing the narrowing of a linking object. So it should only be a few as we move towards that healing process. But initially, it's going to be a lot of things that remind us of that person. You're going to want to keep all their sweatshirts and all their shirts and clothes and shoes and sunglasses and hats and all of that. But eventually, it might just be their favorite items, right? So those should lessen with time as well. But these are just some common symptoms of grief. I didn't check the chat. Did anybody add to the symptoms of grief? Let's see.
We did not have any additions, but there's a question.
Okay.
Have you worked with people whose loss is due to estrangement, and how might that differ from physical death? An emotional death of a relationship that looks to never be reconciled?
Yes, actually, I have dealt with a lot of estrangement. Like I said, the loss doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It can be estrangement, it could be divorce, it could be a house loss, a job loss. So it's typically the same process that you deal with, and you deal with a lot of these same symptoms of grief. It's a little bit more complex, just because that person is still here and there's that choice of either estrangement from whichever party. Um, but this is all something that does relate, because they're still going to have to go from head to heart with that grief in the morning, in order to feel that what we call reconciliation or that healing at the end. I say the end, but that's a loose term. I mean, there's really no end. But yeah, and there's different ways, and it's mourning processes might look a little different, right? Like we might not obviously set out a plate for that person or, you know, visit their favorite places, but it might look like writing a letter, and, you know, don't always encourage the person to send it, because sometimes that's could be tumultuous. So it just kind of depends. But yes, I've dealt with a decent amount of estrangement. So,
There's another question.
yeah.
Excuse. How is suicide loss grief different than grief from a loved one by natural causes?
Okay. So that also goes in that bracket of complex loss, right? So suicide loss is very complex. So typically you're going to see a lot more. Um, you're not going to see that you're going to see these common symptoms of grief, but you're going to see things in addition to. So you are going to see the depression, you're going to see anxiety, you're going to see a lot more lethargy of grief, short-term, potential long-term memory loss. So it differs in the way of just that level of complexity. I feel like I could do a whole seminar on complex grief in itself, or even suicide grief, just because there's so much. So whoever asked that question, if you would like me to send you some resources, I'm more than willing to do that. If you want to give Danielle some information, because I feel like that would be a whole path to go down as far as the difference between suicide loss and death of natural causes.
Cody, if any of the stuff that we talk about with the questions, if you want to send me resources, I can email everyone that attended. Maybe make it easy. So,
Yeah. Yeah, no,
um,
that would be great.
okay,
That would be wonderful.
awesome.
Okay. So I know that doesn't answer the question fully, but if you're a clinician and it goes into that complex diagnosis, or if you're somebody who's experienced it, again, it goes into that complex bracket of things. Yeah. So, okay. Next slide. All right. So here's some actions to facilitate mourning. And again, if depending on manner of death or loss, your mourning might look a little different. But if we're talking about a significant loss, we're hopefully going to encourage the person, or if that's you that's grieving, to talk or write about the person who died. Culturally, we all typically come from, hopefully not we all, I hope there's people in this audience that have open family systems, but because, again, we're emotion phobic, anti-death culture, we typically come from closed households, or closed family system is what we call it. Oops. Um, so an open family system is a healthy family who might talk about the person who died, might include them in different traditions. A closed family system is what we probably are going to be a little bit more familiar with, where even such as like children don't attend the funeral, or we don't talk about Aunt Susie who died 2 months ago because that would upset Uncle Bill, right? Things like that, more of those cultural norms. So talking or writing about the person is something that you can actively facilitate to kick into that mourning process. And side note, with children, I do work a lot with kids. And what I learned from my mentor, Dr. Alan Wolfeld, is a child old enough to love is a child old enough to grieve. So I always encourage, because I do get asked if people should bring children to funerals. And I 100% say yes, because again, like he says, any child old enough to grieve or old enough to love is old enough to grieve. And it brings kind of, again, you kind of defeat that goldfish phenomenon again, because you're teaching the kids, it is okay to cry. It is okay to be sad. Here's a place where we can go to remember this person that we've lost, right? Staying connected to those linking objects. And again, in a healthy grief process, so long as those lessen over time. I know of a case where somebody had lost a sibling, and it had been years, and that sibling would see their therapist, carry the ashes in the pocket, which is not a bad idea, but would wear their siblings' clothes, would want to move where their sibling moved, tried to get a job at the place where their sibling worked, right? So there's that bit of an unhealthy norm to that linking. object because they didn't lessen over time. Now, if it was just they were carrying their siblings' ashes in their pocket, okay, right? Or if you wanted to wear their shirt every once in a while, totally okay. But there becomes a line, and it's a little hairy, but overall it should lessen over time. So to facilitate that linking object there to for mourning. And then displaying photos of the person who died. Um, Early in grief, it is really difficult for people to look at photos of those who passed on. And that's a normal thing. People feel guilty for not being able to because it hurts or, it makes them cry. Again, by displaying those photos, you're facilitating that mourning, that outward movement. And then if you are able to, after you're able to look at the photos, we encourage people to then start watching videos. Those are a whole new level of things because it's active movement. You're hearing the person, you're seeing them move, you're hearing their voice. So that's a little bit of a run from the beginning. So if we can start with displaying the photos first, we can facilitate that mourning process. And then visiting places of special significance. That's huge. So if you have somebody, and you have a bench somewhere for someone and you go sit on that, on Sundays or whatever you guys decide to do, but visiting places of special significance, and it could be the cemetery where you feel close to them. Reviewing photo albums. So again, not only displaying the photos, but going through those old photos. So once you're able to get used to a photo or two, then maybe adding them and going through some photo albums. And then having ceremonies on nodal events. So nodal events are just those big days. So Christmas, right? New Year's, birthdays, anniversary dates, death dates, things like that. So if we can create ceremonies on those days or close to those days, we're facilitating that mourning for that person. Go ahead. Next slide. Okay. So when to seek help. So this is something that, again, can get a little complex, but if it's something that your symptoms of grief have hardened over time, and what I mean by hardened is they've not subsided in any way and actually sometimes get significantly worse. If they have done that, I definitely suggest reaching out, whether it's to a support system, friend, family member, a therapist, whoever you feel comfortable with. And what I do want to know when we talk about reaching out to people, there's what we call this rule of thirds. So you have a third of the people in your life who are neutral when you've experienced a loss, right? They're not going to help you, but they're not going to harm you. They're not going to say anything that's going to hurt your feelings, but they're certainly not going to help you either. They might stay away. They might be distant. They might be the people that say, call me if you need anything, right? And then you've got your helpful third, which those people are the people who are in the trenches with you, who are very willing to talk, not afraid to ask about the person and use that person's name who died, right? And then there's also that unhelpful third or the hurtful third, right? Where they say things that don't necessarily jive with your feelings, right? They might be harmful. They might not mean it as harm, but we know that they're a harmful third. So if you can kind of look at your support system and place it out in thirds and say, okay, is this person a helpful third, a hurtful third, or neutral third? I think that we can really, really help ourselves by going to those helpful people. Does that make sense? I hope. And then if you have a difficult time thinking or talking about the person who died when there's a long period of time that's occurred, I can give an example of somebody who I had seen who had lost a parent when they were young, never had talked about that parent, never had acknowledged the loss of that parent until 50 years later. And that person then started mourning that process and had a breakdown in session and was very surprised by the idea that they were never really thinking about this person or talking about the person, and all of a sudden now that this parent has been gone for over 50 years, why are they crying about it now? Well, it's because they were stuck in that grief. They never made that movement towards mourning, so they never mourned the loss of that parent. And, I think that's where you get stuck. That's where I go back to that first question of, can you have grief without mourning? Absolutely. And that's a perfect example of having that grief without mourning. It's you stay stuck in that process. And then, you might experience different mental health ailments such as anxiety, depression, and you're thinking, well, this is strange. I've always been an anxious person. Well, if we look back, where did that start? Is it unresolved grief? Potentially, it could be unembarked, where you've never embarked on that process, if that makes any sense to anybody. And then when grief is affecting your daily functioning, um, that first year, we typically call that the psychic numbing, right? Where our body doses that grief for us. And we're just kind of, anybody who's experienced a significant loss, it's what we call that fog, right? That fog typically dissipates about a year after, or 18 to 36 months, depending on the severity of the loss and the manner of death as well. But that fog is there to help protect you for that first year. So there's going to be a lot of difficulty in daily functioning. That doesn't mean you shouldn't ask for help. So still do ask for help, whether again it's reaching out to your helpful third, or if you have somebody in clergy that you trust, or even a therapist. I think that when it's affecting that daily functioning, if you're not working, if you're not getting out of bed, if you're not living life not how you did, because that's not going to happen, but if you're not living healthily, if your hygiene is suffering, if your health is suffering, if you're not eating, if you're not sleeping, those are different times when we should be seeking that help. And again, doesn't necessarily mean you have to seek help with a therapist, but you can always reach out and to a therapist and see if that's something that you should be seen for. And then again, when you have that difficulty moving grief into mourning, so it kind of goes back with the difficulty talking or thinking about that person. The thinking about that person will typically occur, but if you're shutting that off like a faucet, that's definitely a time to seek help, because we're going to get in that mode where we're so used to shutting that faucet off that we're going to really, really hinder our ability, and we're going to have to do what's called catch-up mourning, which, like I said before, where that person that came in with over 50 years of grief and mourning, or grief, not mourning, had to experience that mourning process. We had to catch him up so that he could then experience all the different losses that he was coming in for. Okay, next slide.
Before we go, there is another question. How do you address guilt associated with a loss when the person feels they should have done something to prevent the loss?
The survivor's guilt, right?
Yeah.
So typically that is a very common symptom of grief and loss, especially with suicide loss. Again, that's just a very complex experience in general if it's related to suicide. But can you read that one more time so I can answer it efficiently?
Yes, one second. Um, how do you address guilt associated with a loss when the person feels they should have done something to prevent the loss?
How do I address it? Okay, so we go back to that facilitating that mourning process. So again, you can go and you can have them express, their thoughts and their feelings about their guilt, and recognizing that again, that's that paradox. We experience the survival's guilt or survivor's guilt, but it also can be seen when we experience happiness when we're moving through that, when we're cultivating through that process of our mourning. But you can do things such as writing a letter again to that person, to yourself. A lot of it's that self-forgiveness work of, and you can work with a therapist with that. We can't take that guilt away, but we can hopefully lessen those symptoms. I mean, I can't take it away. That you can take it away from yourself, but nobody else can take that away from you. So it's doing things that facilitate that mourning, but just in a little bit of a different manner. So again, writing a letter, talking about that experience and how you do feel guilty, and opening up to again a helpful third. It's a lot of it is that processing of that mourning. And hopefully that answers the question. Okay, and then how to seek help. So obviously you can call, and I put in here a grief-informed therapist. Um, I talk a lot about this because there are a lot of therapists all over, and I can say this because I have my degree. We don't get taught about grief in grad school. And when we do, it's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And again, I taught you, we have to unlearn that. That's not even accurate, right? So by having a grief-informed therapist, you're going to get a lot more morning work done. Not saying that, other therapists, I don't want to discount other therapists in any way, but if you have a therapist who understands the difference and who is grief informed, um, that's what you're going to have to look for. It's kind of like when you find somebody, if you have a heart issue, you're not going to go seek a neurologist, right? Same with other types of therapy. If you're dealing with addictions, you're not going to see someone who doesn't work with addictions. So making sure that when you do find a therapist, make sure they are grief informed if that's what you're going for. And by grief informed, it means they know, the differences of grief versus mourning. They know, how to get from head to heart, because that's very important. Um, and then again, hopefully they use some sort of companion model versus a treatment model, because again, this does not go away. It never will. It's just lessening with time. It becomes lighter. You'll never hear me use the phrase move on. I'll always say either move forward or continue life, or learn to live without, right? Because again, it just doesn't go away. Okay, and then seeking support through friends and family. So going back to that helpful third rule, right? Making sure we've got a third of those people who are helpful and going to seek support through them. And sometimes those hurtful thirds can be friends and family, and they might surprise you. But do remember that intention is the best thing. People most likely are not intending to hurt your feelings when they say things that are hurtful. They don't know that they're necessarily in the hurtful third. They probably don't mean it. So just remember intention, intention, intention on that. And you can always say things, if necessary. And you can say, I understand you're trying to help me, but can I explain to you why that doesn't help me, right? Finding different phrases that might help with that. And then following through with a support group or church. I know in the area, I don't have any support groups going right now. I'm actually working on getting a widows group. So if anybody wants that information, I'll kind of put that in there as well. I'm working on doing that. I work a lot with bereaved parents. So that's my next group I want to do after the widows group. But there is grief share through churches. You guys will have my information, so you can always reach out if you need to find a support group, whether it's online, whether it's in person. But the grief share is in person and it's at a church. I do know that's the only other in-person one that I know of right now off the top of my head. I haven't done research on it in a little while. But yeah.
I'd be happy to add some different
Yeah.
grief
Oh yeah.
groups.
That would be amazing. So
You do have some more questions also.
yeah, go ahead.
Um, do you have the name of a grief counseling book that you can recommend?
Yes. Let me grab it. Let me show you it. Okay. So again, not to, plug Dr. Alan Wolfelt, but his work is really transformative in the grief world. So this is called Understanding Your Grief by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. You can find it either on Amazon or you can find it in his library on his website. If you just Google his name, Alan D. Wolfelt, Wolfelt. And it's just called Understanding Your Grief. So it'll explain your 6 central needs of mourning. It's really your just basics grief book, like what you're going to be experiencing, shows you the difference between grief and mourning, shows you those touchstones. And then it's called 10 Essential Touchstones for Finding Hope and Healing Your Heart. And what I love about his books and his work is it's written for anybody. You don't have to have a degree to understand it. He really writes to the person reading. So if you're a clinician, I've got other clinical books that, he does have, but for basics, even for clinicians wanting to become grief informed, I always suggest this, just because I even have my bookmark in it because I was just using it in a session. But this is just something that I've held close to my heart. And he also has a journal that goes with it. if for some reason, you read the book and you want to do the journaling piece with it, it is a great journal. And then he's got, gosh, I think last I knew he had just under 100 books that he's written on grief alone. So he has a book for just about any kind of grief you can, you've experienced. And again, he writes to the reader, and he writes for lay people, so you don't have to have any sort of degree or anything to understand it. It's really quite simple, and I just love that about him. So
Thank you.
um,
And then the others were a lot of thank yous for how you're explaining some of these terms.
yeah. And I think too, one thing to remember when we're dealing with grief is no rewards for speed, because grief is recursive, right? It's going to come back. It's like a roller coaster, right? It's recursive. So no rewards for speed, and not being attached to an outcome, because I think a lot of times our world, we're so we have this need for instant gratification, and when we don't have speed, we don't have an outcome, people are so lost, right? But if you can just be a companion for those who are grieving, that is the best case that we can have, because you're allowing and you're holding space for a person to mourn, right? And again, moving from head to heart, you have to mourn in order to get to that heart piece. So,
With saying that, I know there's no end, so how long do you typically see some of your clients?
how long do I see some of my clients?
Yeah, because
I
there's
would
no
say
end to grief.
average is about 1 to 2 years as far as grief related. However, I would say bulk of my clientele right now is 4 plus years. And it's more of maintenance, where they've come weekly for a period of time, then they went to bi-weekly, then monthly, and now it's just checking in every now and again, sometimes around the anniversary or holidays. But I would say typically when people are experiencing a loss, they either reach out right away, where they say, hey, this happened 2 weeks ago, or they wait for this window of between 18 and 36 months. And that's again, once all the support system is typically kind of withered away and they're feeling lost and life has kind of returned back to normal, like their world has kept going, and they have to return to work or they have to do this, and they've been doing it for a while, but they still can't understand why they're not feeling normal. So that's kind of what I see a lot of the times. And we also don't suggest anybody making any big emotional decisions within the first year, or sorry, first 3 years of a significant loss. Because we've seen it where people move away and say, well, we were supposed to retire in Florida, so I'm just going to go. I know he's gone, but I'm just going to go. It might have been a year or 2 years. Well, what you're doing is you're moving yourself away from, hopefully not, but you're moving yourself away from your support system and you're isolating, right? So we don't typically suggest any big decisions within the first 3 years. So,
What is your suggestions on how someone should address, help, and handle when someone has not moved to mourning, even though they're active in grief awareness and death prevention? They are masking their mourning with activism.
okay. So wanting to get somebody else help, is that accurate? Is that kind of what you're gathering?
That's how I'm reading it, yeah.
Okay. So how to get somebody to acknowledge that, right? And a lot of it is asking about the person who died and using their first name. So, if it's say a sibling of yours and their spouse passed away, and you can say, hey, how are you doing since Bill passed away? How are you really doing? And you can kind of gauge what their reaction is going to be and if they're going to want to seek that help. You can give them referrals, obviously, like, hey, I know of this support group, so and so went and they said it was amazing. Or, I know of a therapist you might, want to see, but asking them first how they're doing with it, and then going from there to see kind of how resistant they are, because they could be utilizing some avoidant tendencies. And, if they don't want to talk about said bill, then we know that, they are definitely stuck in that grief process, and encouraging them to seek help outside of you and their helpful third. So seeking more of that professional help.
Is there a best way to encourage that without maybe offending them?
Um, it's a really tricky question because people in grief they're very unpredictable, right? Um, so we've got a lot of mood swings and things like that. So you can either, refer a book. Sometimes people refer books. Dr. Wolfelt has another one called Healing. Hold on, I have it. It's a short. This one's nice because it's a very short book. It's only 99 pages. And it's called The First Aid for Broken Hearts. So if there's somebody who's typically avoidant in their grief, I will hand them this. Um, and there's some exercises they can do within the book at the end. They don't have to, but it kind of gives them that kind of kickstart to be like, hey, I notice what's going on. I notice that, you're grieving, but you're not mourning. And maybe even you could explain that process to them now that you are grief informed, to know that there is a difference between and how important it is to utilize that movement from your head to your heart. So again, it's, providing a resource and risking the fact that you might offend the person because of that unpredictability. But we can just say, hey, I did it out of my heart. I didn't mean to offend you. That's not my intention. I just worry about you. I love you, and I want you to, be the best person you can be. So hopefully that can help.
I think this might be a follow-up.
Yeah.
What do you do if they refuse to acknowledge the grieving process, where it's now bleeding into other aspects of their life, no matter how much you support or um, other support or recommend resources?
Yeah, that one's hard, right? Because if you refer to therapy, right? Um, I'm very much a proponent of what you put into therapy is what you're going to receive it. So if somebody's very resistant to the idea of therapy and they go and they're, closed off and not connecting, and it's been a few times, right? They might not be in the headspace quite yet. So give them a little bit of time first. I don't know how much time has passed since, if you have a specific person you're thinking of with that question. Um, but, you know, recognizing that it is bleeding into it, trying to remain a helpful third. And then if they end up being willing, provide them a grief informed therapist, because it sounds like that would require some professional help versus the helpful third.
Do you have other suggestions for mourning practices specifically for the holidays?
Yes. So doing things such as, if it was somebody close in your family, putting their stocking out, right? You're actively showing that you're allowing them to participate. I had mentioned, putting a plate out for Christmas if you guys decide to celebrate and have dinner. Cooking one of their favorite meals if it's somebody who was old enough to have a favorite meal, or dessert. I just had this for Thanksgiving where several people, I had suggested about the dessert, and I had several pictures in my email after the holidays of people who had put out a plate of pie for that person at the dinner table. So you can do things like that. Just doing things in honor of that person. So if that person loved to go to Mississippi and look at the lights, if that's something that you can do, I know it's going to be hard for you. And I know that that's probably going to create some uncomfortable emotion, but those uncomfortable emotions are what that mourning is. And it's that crying, that's that heavy feeling.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's all I see at the moment.
Okay. I think that was the end of my presentation, and I think the next slide was just for questions and reflections. Um, so if anybody has any additional reflections or questions, um, let me know. I know this was just a bit of a basics course and really short, but yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you very much. Would you mind if in a follow-up email to everyone I sent your contact information as well? Okay, great. Well, thank you for all of that wonderful information. I think it's very helpful, especially during this time of year, but also always to
Yeah,
remember.
absolutely.
A lot of people are sharing thank yous in the the chat too, just so
Oh,
you know.
good. Well, thank you guys all for listening. I appreciate being a part of this. So thank you.
We hope to have you back again.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Cody. And thank you everyone for spending your lunch hour with us. If you do have questions, I will be sending out that email here soon. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, guys.